Hello and welcome to What the Lux with me, Fred Moore.
And me, Anand Sharma.
Together we lead Matter of Form, a design consultancy specialising in brand, digital experience and content. And this is a podcast that calls time on tired ideas of luxury.
Alongside industry luminaries and thought leaders, we explore what truly defines category-leading products and services. Sven-Olof Lindblad is the founder and CEO of Lindblad Expeditions, a pioneer in responsible travel whose life has been shaped by some of the planet's wildest places. Born in Switzerland and raised on expeditions with his father, Lars Erik Lindblad, who opened up the Galapagos and Antarctica to non-scientific travellers, Sven built a company around exploration, education and conservation. Today, Lindblad Expeditions partners with National Geographic to deliver small ship journeys that connect guests to nature in profound ways while supporting science, culture and community. Sven, welcome.
Thank you. A quick clarification, Anant, is as of January, I'm no longer the CEO. I'm the co-chairman. I found a CEO to handle the day-to-day work. So,
If shirt buttons are the measure of a man's stress levels, then I could tell something had changed. Congratulations. Has that been a nice process of transition?
oh, fantastic. Yes.
That's a significant tenure and presumably quite satisfying and rewarding after the stresses you've been through with the financial downturn first and then COVID, to be able to, frankly, not bear the brunt of the day-to-day operational, well, the stresses of it all. Let's put it that way.
Well, I think the most relevant thing was that as a consequence of those events, particularly COVID, you're just fighting fires all the time, and you don't really have time to think about, well, how do you want to develop the business? How do you want to, where do you want to go? What are you going to do to think 5 years out? You can't do any of those things. So now I feel relieved. I can start thinking about the company from a broader perspective without having to deal with the day-to-day activities.
Do you find relieving yourself of those stresses allows you to be more creative, more proactive, more imaginative about how you grow the business and the ideas you have that you bring to the table?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Because I can wake up and I can do a variety of things like that. I just spent a month in Baja California exploring because I wanted to revitalize our activities in that part of the world in part and connect with some conservation ideas that I'm keenly interested in. I would not have been able to do that while still being CEO.
Sven, I'd love to talk to you about some of those conservation ideas, but before we get to that, can we talk about your father? He led some of the first non-scientific expeditions to the Galapagos and then to Antarctica. Can you talk a bit about him just as a precursor to our conversation about Lindblad today?
Well, first of all, I mean, when he started his company in 1958, he really was the only person traveling to many of these places. And his motivation was he was never interested per se in running a business. That was not his motivation. His motivation was being an explorer. And in those days, you had to be, if you were going to be an explorer, you had to have a patron or you had to have independent wealth. He didn't have any of those things. So he couldn't do that. Then he thought about, well, maybe I should become a missionary. The trouble was he wasn't religious. Well, that was a problem. Uh, and then he wound up by default pursuing the travel industry. And he felt that if he could develop ideas and ways to visit the places he was interested in a meaningful way, then by doing it as a business, he could get to these places, he could explore these places. And so he became an explorer via the travel industry.
What year was this? When was it? This was before 79.
Yeah, well, this was he started in 1958, but then
50 years, sorry.
he first went to Antarctica in 1966, and he wasn't amongst the first. He was the first in all these places. And, when you think about it, in 1966, going to the Antarctic on a chartered Chilean Navy vessel, that was essentially like going to the moon in many ways. I mean, it was that exotic, and the whole world was captivated by the idea that he was bringing laymen together with scientists to this part of the world that had never been visited by anybody but explorers before. So he was really at the forefront of making it possible for people to do this. And that was true in the Antarctic, it was true in Galapagos, in the Easter Island, Mongolia, eventually China. I mean, he really opened up the world. And he is, in my mind, unquestionably the father of what many people refer to as ecotourism.
What types of people went on the expeditions? Was it a real mixture?
It was, but I remember because as a young guy, when my first real exposure to his guests was in the early 70s when where I traveled around a bit on his ship, the Lindblad Explorer. And the guests were incredibly exotic in many instances because this is the only way you could do this, only way you could get to these places. And there were some really incredibly interesting people traveling on the ships all the time. And of course, it was the 70s too, which was totally different than what it is now.
What was it like growing up? How did it shape you? I presume you went on all of the expeditions, and that was a key part of your youth.
No, no, I actually didn't. When I was 19, I went to Kenya. Well, I went to Uganda first for a summer, and then I wound up staying in East Africa for 7 years and working on a variety of different projects. But I went every now and then. I wound up going on one of his expeditions somewhere in the world. But it was, my youth or my development, if you will, was really shaped by my time in East Africa more than anything else.
So how long did you spend in East Africa?
7 years. And then my father, the last thing I was working on when I was there, I was working on a book about elephants, photographing elephants. So I've been doing that for a year and a half. And he came to my camp one day and asked if I would consider coming back to the United States and working for him. And interestingly enough, I mean, he was like this heroic figure for me, who I didn't see very much of in my life because he was always traveling. Occasionally, I was able to. I went with him, but most of the time he was out there on his own exploring. And I said yes, and I reluctantly left Kenya. I was living in Kenya at the time, and came back to the United States and worked for him for a period of time
In New York.
in New York.
What was it? It's quite a big culture change leaving Kenya, which must have been a wonderful place to live, especially at that period of time, and then coming to New York to run a fairly commercial enterprise.
It was a massive difference. I mean, for my days were waking up at 5:30, 6 o'clock, getting into my car, trying to figure out where I was going to go and photograph, cooking my meal at the end of the day, and then going out again and doing that the next day. So this was, radically different.
How old were you when you started taking the reins over?
I didn't take the reins over. What I did was, so I worked for my father for a year and a half, and And then I said there were a variety of reasons. The main one was in 1977, uh, Lindblad Travel, my father's company, was opening up China for Americans. He's the only American operator allowed to bring people to China. And so that completely dominated the company. I mean, it was a massive change in terms of focus. And by that point, I was sort of imbued with the idea of what Lindblad Travel was prior to China, more focused on nature, smaller travel, smaller group travel. Uh, his ship operating in these incredibly remote areas, focused primarily on nature, but also culture and history. And I felt the company was losing that focus. And so I made a proposal to develop originally a division of Lindblad Travel called Special Expeditions, which required $20,000 of capital. I had five. If you agree to put in 15,000, you can own 75%, and I'll own 25%. And he ultimately agreed. Let me just make sure this is on silent, because that's what it was meant to be. Eventually, he agreed. And in July of 1979, I formulated this company called, at that time, Special Expeditions, and then 3 years later, I bought out Lindblad Travel shares in that, and it became a totally independent company. So I never ran his company. I worked in his company for a short period of time and then developed this one. It was a little bit of an odd situation having a secondary company working side by side with your father's company, but we kind of managed to do that. And at the end of the day, my feeling was that, look, I can't tell him how to run his company because he built it, And so I had some different ideas and different thoughts. And so this was a good way for us to navigate the future without running into conflict.
So it was entrepreneurship driven by a desire not to take direction from one's father.
Well, it wasn't so much not take direction. It was that I was so deeply committed to what were the origins of Lindblad travel, its essence was. And I was not even remotely attracted to how it was developing at the time.
What was the difference?
The focus changed completely. And so the company became almost entirely China focused. So it wasn't, again, it had nothing to do with being any problem with China per se. It had to do with just that kind of dominance of a geography, which resulted in a totally different kind of experience. And so what I wanted to do was I didn't want to do something new. I wanted to protect what was at the time.
So talk to us about what then happened as you began to develop special expeditions from 79 onwards. And how did you start building momentum, and what were the key moments where you really felt the business changed, and the seminal moments?
Oh, well, they change rather frequently. But if I go back and think about how it all sort of started. So I started with some land-based programs based on areas that I had familiarity with. So obviously East Africa was one of them. And I remember the first program we put out there was called Among the Great Herds, and it was totally counter to what was normal in terms of creating an African safari, because it was of 2 weeks. We spent 1 week in one place, and people said to me, "Sven, nobody's ever going to buy that." I said, "But this one place was the perfect place at that particular time of year to be situated, and so there was no good reason to move from that place." And it turned out to be incredibly successful. Uh, People just loved the idea, and we started with, I think, like 4 departures or something like this. We had to double it instantly, and that was our first activity. And then the second area I was really keen on was India, because I had quite a bit of familiarity with India. I'd spent a lot of time there. Always found India to be ultimately the most interesting country in the world for a variety of reasons. So we started programs in India, and then eventually I started some programs in the United States, in the American Southwest and in the West. But what really changed dramatically was when I got involved with, to me, ships were like the camps I used to have in Africa, which meant that you could move with the seasons. You weren't stuck anywhere specifically. You could go to places where there was no infrastructure, and you could get away from any trappings of tourism. So the first ship I got involved with was one I chartered for 4 months and used in Baja California. And then a year later, another ship that I used in Alaska. And it was a real learning curve to actually operate ships, because it was way more complex than anything I'd accomplished before. And we made tons of mistakes, uh, you know, just miscalculations, not thinking of this, not being as cognizant as we should about certain regulations, and blah, blah, blah.
What was the impact of a mistake?
Oh, it was like sometimes up until the last second, you thought you weren't going to be able to operate because you hadn't dealt with a particular form. Sometimes you wound up losing money. We wound up losing money, even if a trip was full, because we had miscalculated expenses. So there were these mistakes made along the way, but each one of them was very instructive, and we sort of internalized it, studied it, so that we could understand what actually happened, and with the intent of not repeating it. We were pretty good at not repeating mistakes. We made plenty of them. We tended not to repeat them, the same ones in any case. And so, but everything we put out there was received well by audiences. So that was obviously very, very important. And what we did have is we did have access, based on a contractual agreement, to Lindblad Travel's audience. So I didn't have to focus on marketing and building an audience. I could focus all of our energy on building ideas, which was a huge, huge relief and a huge benefit. Then in 1987, it was 1987. That was the year we got our first ship on a permanent basis. And that changed the game entirely because before we had chartered ships and we relied to some considerable extent on the owners for hiring of crew and certain aspects of what it was. But now we had to do it all ourselves. That resulted in another, a new series of mistakes,
Steep learning curve.
steep learning curve. Uh, and and from there, we wound up building our business up until 2017 by adding ships that were fundamentally, well, they were built by other people who got in trouble. And plenty of people who built ships got in trouble and at some point wanted to relinquish them. So there were very few that stayed in the hands of the same owners for too long. And so there was a sort of an endless supply of ships that we could access that were not perfect, but with some modifications could suit our purposes.
On the whole, were they other expedition cruise ships?
Well, not necessarily. One was a ferry originally that had then become a small expedition ship that we then wound up acquiring. One was originally built as a North Sea fishing trawler that fished for shrimp in the winter in the North Sea. Incredibly stable ship, turned into a passenger ship, didn't last in its original capacity, was sold to somebody else, and then eventually to us. Two others were originally built as passenger ships. So it's interesting if you look at sort of the history of any one of these ships and what it's gone through in its lifetime. And they all have different stories.
How long is the life of a ship?
It depends. Like we have ships now that were built in the 70s that they're two of our ships that are not particularly complex. And as long as you do what I refer to as preventative maintenance, in other words, you don't wait for something to go wrong. You're ahead of it all the time. You can make them last for, well, in this case, 50 years.
What's the financial model behind how you bankroll a ship? Because if there's such variable lifespans based on the measures that you take to maintain it, how do you sort of calculate depreciation? How do you fund it? It's quite an overwhelming thing to buy your first ship. You're taking on a huge asset.
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter, or the true answer to that question is at the time, I had no idea about those things. I didn't think about those things. I just said, okay, I can buy this ship for X.
How much is the ship?
Well, it depends. I
Well,
mean,
back then, how much was your first ship, roughly?
the first one it started as a bareboat charter, which meant I had full responsibility for it, and I paid the owners a certain amount per month. I think it was 3,000 a month. And then after 2 years, there was an option to buy it at a certain amount. And I can't remember what it was. And so that's what we did. And that's how we worked out. Each ship has a different story. One of the ships that we still have now, we were chartering that ship in the late 80s, I think it was. And the owner or the company that had the ship chartered it from a group of owners, and that company went bankrupt. And so all of a sudden we have 3 months worth of charter with a full ship, and the company went bankrupt. And so I went to the owners and I said, look, I have a proposition for you guys. I cannot pay you for this ship, but I accept what you're suggesting it's worth. And I will agree to that amount, but I won't be able to pay you for it until a certain amount of time elapses. So I offered them a payment structure. I said, plus you have to put in $500,000 to bring it up to the standards that we require, because I don't have the money for that either. And then I said, now I'm going to leave the room and you guys could legitimately tell me to disappear, and I would understand that. But the reality is if you accept this offer, you're going to get the value for the ship. I promise you that. And they did. They accepted it, and they did very, very well out of the transactions. So each one is a very, very different story.
How do you balance the sense of the known with the sense of the unknown when you're communicating to your guests?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I remember when I was designing African safaris in Tanzania, I was completely annoyed with the way a particular place, which was iconic, was developing, a place called Ngorongoro Crater. And I said, instead of spending 2 days in this place, which is overwhelmed by tourists, There's plenty of other places we could go instead that could be provide what was, in my opinion, a way more interesting experience. And so I developed something that excluded that, and it was distinctly unsuccessful. And that was the first time I really realized, well, you have to be careful because if you're in a particular geography, the formula that works best for us is blending the known and the unknown, but you cannot completely discard the known because then there's no hooks for people. So, like, if you want to do something in Greece, for example, even though Santorini is over-visited in many ways, there are ways you can navigate an experience there that is is actually positive. But yeah, you have to really use time, and you have to think that through. But if you avoid it entirely, it's it potentially is a disaster from the perspective of people's willingness to sign on. No, and then there are, of course, those places where nobody knows anything specific about the area, and there you have a lot more latitude too.
Has it always been the preserve of the high net worth, these expeditions, would you say?
Well, the reality is that this bothers me a lot sometimes, is that if you're going to do something small and do it well, it's going to be expensive. There's no way around it. But we have lots of people that have decided that something like this is worthwhile. They appreciate how we approach it, and they've saved up for sometimes for years. I met a baker once who had saved up for 10 years to take an expedition to Antarctica. So it's not just the province of the ultra high net worth people. And it's certainly not I mean, for us, it's certainly not the flashy people. We could, if you sort of added up the net worth of people on any particular expedition, it would probably be quite high, but you would never know it by the behavior of the people, put it that way.
Yeah, although I do think that people once used possessions as status symbols, now they try and capture their experiences and wear them as symbols of status. How has the profile of the adventurer changed as that changes happen in the world?
Well, there's a couple of really positive changes. Like one, and this was a post 9/11 phenomenon. We had a massive increase in family travel, which was interesting. Not because we did anything particular to encourage that, it just happened. We had a lot more where we would get groups of friends traveling together, and a lot more non-traditional groupings, like a father with his grown daughter, or a mother with her two sisters, or you know, before that it used to be way more predictable. You would have couples and you have widows, uh, and so it's changed dramatically in that regard. But what I think is most interesting is how people process information that's changed. So, and you have to be adaptable to that. You have to deal with people based on how they establish their needs. So, once upon a time, you could have a naturalist standing in front of a bird's nest and talking for 45 minutes about their habits and what they were doing and how they fed and mated and whatever, and people would stand there enthralled listening to that. And not anymore. They want, you know, max 5 minutes there, and then they want to move on. So it's and there's so much information, detailed information that people can get in other ways that they don't want to use their time in the field to be talked to.
Do you think the appetite for that depth of knowledge still exists? It's just consumed in a different way. The thing that stood out to me that you said there is people don't want to sort of waste time in the field. Perhaps, absorbing information that they could research in other ways. Does that mean that they want to be more present, or they want to, what is it how do they want to spend their time if not learning about the environment they're in?
I'm not saying they don't want to learn, but what they're willing to learn while they're just there, standing there, different. And so they just want to move on. So they want to cover more ground, for example. They're not going to stand at that one nest for 45 minutes when there's something over the horizon they're curious about. And they figure that if I want to learn more about the habits of that particular bird, whatever, I can go to the internet and I can find that out. I can read a book. I can do any number of things. Uh, but I want to take full advantage of where I am and experience it more broadly. I have to say, in many ways, I've always, I'm like obsessed with what's over the next horizon. So if somebody's holding me back and I can't see what's around the corner or whatever, I get a little agitated. And I don't want to necessarily sit and be, talked at and slowed down.
That's a fairly entrepreneurial quality.
I get very, very itchy at that point. So I get that. So I don't view that as a negative. I view that as, I get it.
On the subject of education, what was it that led you to your partnership with National Geographic? It's obviously quite an important aspect of your business.
So National Geographic has always been part of my life. I have in my office, I have walls of National Geographic magazines going back to 1947, I think. And, National Geographic used to be really the Google for explorers. I mean, if I wanted to find out about a place, I would go to National Geographic. If I wanted to figure out who was, you know, involved, who was exploring that part of the world, I'd go to National Geographic. And so to me, the whole logic of National Geographic is an institution whose mission was, their tagline was the world and all that's in it, to disseminate that through their various channels, their television channels, their magazine, of course, their iconic magazine or magazines, websites, etc. So I felt that, okay, here's National Geographic, the world and all that's in it, and here are we that take you there. This is a natural partnership. So I figured out all the areas where our two organizations could intersect, and then I went to the CEO of National Geographic, got a meeting with him, and put the idea forward, and he immediately agreed that this made sense. And that was like 15 years ago, but 1987, I think. No, when was it? 2007. Was it 2007? I can't even remember now exactly what it was. Long time ago. And it's been 2006. It was 2006.
What do you think it's brought to your business that is unique?
Well, it's fun. I mean, we have a multifaceted partnership. So first of all, on a pure business level, the brand recognition of National Geographic is huge. It's one of the most beloved brands in the world, even amongst people who don't understand why they love it so much. They love it. And so, we are a well-known brand, Lindblad Expeditions, in a very small community. National Geographic is known in obviously exponentially larger community. So that in itself has huge value. The network of explorers, scientists, people thinking about what's going on in the world, uh, writers, photographers, filmmakers is huge, and they are a tremendous resource when we think about what we're going to do. And we, for example, on four of our ships, we have a National Geographic photographer on every departure to help people develop their photographic skills. We have a joint conservation fund called the Lindblad National Geographic Fund. And now we're, raising $3.5 plus or minus million a year that we funnel into conservation education and exploration. And so they're just, I am so happy to be connected with an institution that has such, relevance. I view National Geographic as an essential institution because we need to understand what's going on in the world, both from a natural history perspective, from a cultural perspective, from a scientific perspective, and National Geographic is one of, if not the best way for people to better understand the world. And so to be connected and to find creative ways to build value. And we have a program with them where we bring 50 teachers a year out into the field and give them an opportunity to come to Washington, D.C. first, have a bit of a training course, go out on one of our ships, work with them afterwards so they can leverage that experience to further benefit their students and their colleagues in their schools. I mean, there's so many layers to this relationship that I think are really neat.
So in places like the Galapagos and Antarctica, how do you balance access with protection? What's the how do you manage the tension between those two things?
Yeah, it's a question. It's a question I've been asked 1,000 times, understandably. And to me, life has always been a scale. I look at everything. I actually visually create a scale. And on one side of the scale is the positive, on the other side is the negative. And there's nothing that does not have something on the negative. But if the balance tips well in favor of the positive, I feel okay about it. Right? So I know that at the end of the day, some of these places are being over visited, and that's a problem. And some people are behaving in ways that they shouldn't, and that's a problem. I feel we do, frankly, a really, really good job mitigating that very, very significantly. And the value of having people experience these things and the effect of that on the world broadly compared to what one might describe as disruption, that's an example of a scale that to me is balances way, way in the positive. So I don't feel bad about it. What we do work on is always, what kind of technology can we use to mitigate or diminish fuel use? How we have people that are completely on top of what is coming out in the future in regard to propulsion. We've done so much work with how to deal more effectively with garbage. We eliminated single-use plastic years and years ago from anything that we do, and we're putting a lot of pressure on our suppliers. So it's a work in progress constantly because anything to do with moving people has consequences, and we're well aware of what they are, and we're really committed to trying to do it with as little intrusion or negative impact as possible.
Sven, I've known you for long enough to know that conservation is more than just a campaign, it's a conviction. What does long-term responsibility, what do you think that looks like for the industry as a whole?
Well, first of all, let's put it this way. If you think about it, conservation, well, first of all, when I refer to conservation in any conversations I have with people, I don't refer to it as philanthropy. I refer to it as investment. And to me, it's a very important distinction because philanthropy is something where, you do that if you have spare liquidity or whatever, then you can be philanthropic. But to me, it's more important that you look upon it as an investment. And so when I talk to folks in the travel industry, I say, have you thought about investing in the assets that you trade upon? In other words, you are not going to have a successful business in a degraded environment, right? And so, you invest in taking care of your buses and your hotels and whatever it is, your ships. What about the investment in the places that you depend upon? It's interesting. I think part of the challenge for the travel industry is, and I don't think people realize this. I learned this first way, way back, and I was completely stunned that the profit margins of travel companies are really, really small, relatively small by and large. There are obviously exceptions. I learned that the biggest fear that a lot of travel companies have is distracting anything that distracts from the focus of profitability. And it would be too long a story to tell you how I learned that, which was a very sad story. But it's if you think about the travel industry in terms of its size, when I was much younger, I felt so strongly that this industry broadly could be activated, and if it was, it could make such a huge difference in terms of how we preserve natural environments, cultural communities, historical monuments. And I felt that this was the most underutilized community in the world in terms of that possibility. I felt it would be relatively easy to encourage the industry to change its behavior or to evolve its behavior. I discovered that it was not as easy as I thought, and it was very depressing at the time. And I used to get quite angry about it, but now I understand it better. It's complex. I mean, travel companies are dealing with challenges all the time. And so things that they don't perceive as essential, it's really hard to get those to see the light of day. People often say to us, well, you're an example, right? And I say, well, that's not really, you can't really say that because at the end of the day, what we're driven by is we came out of the gate where conservation was a core component to our being. The business was secondary and had to support the primary goal. And then over time, we realized that these two things can live side by side very effectively, and that one cannot exist without the other.
What's the hairiest travel moment you've had? You've done all these adventures. What's the moment that will never leave you, where you faced your own mortality?
Well, there were several in Africa. I mean, one was when a rhino wound up inside of my car, which was really rather amazing. It was a Toyota Land Cruiser which was open, and this dentist from New Jersey was very anxious to get a close up of a rhino, and we had been out with him for 2 days, and we hadn't succeeded, and we wound up in this part of the bush where they all of a sudden this rhino was very far away, and we were off the road, and all of a sudden it starts running towards us, and I couldn't for the life of me understand why, because there's no way he saw us, and the wind was not in his favor; it was in our favor. So something scared it on the other side or whatever. But it came running at us, and then all of a sudden I realized it wasn't going to stop, and it came right in the car and took off the front door. I was sitting on the roof of the car. The driver, who is really a skilled guy, he jumped out the last second, and this rhino wound up in the lap of this guy, this New Jersey dentist, and the horn hit my foot. I was looking down, and I'll never forget that. That was quite traumatic.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because you need to have kind of visceral experiences to feel adventure. But adventure isn't a luxury. Adventure is something that you need to be connected to place and to your environment. And how once upon a time there was more mystery in adventure. And today we're in a very researched world where people have an expectation on the experience they are paying for. How has that changed, and how do you balance for these high net worths or people who, perhaps indexing towards the more affluent? How do you balance luxury and adventure?
Well, I guess in part it has to be how you define it. I mean, if I think people ask me often, so the first time I went to Antarctica was in 1973. Okay, so that's obviously a long time ago. And they say, well, what's the difference between then and now? Because I mean, then we were the only people there. It was highly adventurous. We almost got personally killed twice on that particular voyage. No, sorry, three times, mainly because we didn't know what we were doing as well, as well as we do now. So we were doing stupid things that we were out in conditions that we shouldn't have been. I remember like going into a glacial cave following a guy called Keith Shackleton, who was the nephew of Ernest Shackleton. I said, well, if he's doing it, that should be fine. Well, that's like the dumbest thing you could possibly do. And it was plenty adventurous, and I have scars to prove it. But I think now, I actually think it's more interesting based on the knowledge, because you can do things that you wouldn't have dreamt about or shouldn't have dreamt about doing then, because you know more. So, for example, we can take people kayaking in Antarctica. We can go cross country skiing across sea ice. There's all kinds of stuff we can go to navigate in places because we've accumulated the knowledge about where there are hazards that we wouldn't have gone to before. And the reality is, I think an experience now for people is actually more interesting than it was then. The only thing going for then was obviously there's a certain thrill about the fact that you're amongst the first to do something. No question about that. But so it's still adventurous. It's still adventurous. It's not as foolhardy. We think about explorers. We think about we tend to deify a lot of the explorers who got themselves killed, because that's a tangible reflection of danger. And we know less about and think less about the ones who survived.
The ultimate
Yeah,
mark of success.
like Scott in Antarctica, who died with all his men. It's endless lore about the guy. But Amundsen, who got to the South Pole ahead of him and came back with all his men alive, don't speak so much about him.
Can I ask, I know that you've navigated the ship that is Lindblad as a business through turbulent times. Can you talk us through the financial downturn and then also a little bit about COVID and some of the things that you had to grapple with, because you're in an industry that was hit incredibly hard by
Yeah, well,
both?
there were three major events, right? Hit the industry really, really hard. 9/11 was the first. That was very dramatic and short-lived. I mean, it came And there was a certain energy around that did not have a sustainable negative impact. And then there obviously the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. Interestingly enough, this is one of the interesting factors about having, a deep clientele who are somewhat older, is when you're a certain age, the runway changes for you. There's less of it in front of you and more of it behind you. It's going to take more to derail you from what you want to do. And so we actually went down relatively little in 2008, 2009. And, by 2010, we were sort of back to where we should have been. Uh, and people were pretty determined to keep traveling. In 9/11, it was interesting because people completely stopped advertising and people were paralyzed for a period of time. And we decided to do just the opposite. We just said we decided to double down on our communications. I'll never forget management turning to me and saying, Sven, what the hell are you doing? This could drive us out of business. I said, you're absolutely right. I said, but my thesis is if we don't do this, we will absolutely go out of business. So we moved forward and we developed a campaign based around a phrase by Thoreau called "We need the tonic of wildness." It was something I read that somebody had written about, and this notion that nature was a tremendous salve for periods of stress. And we built a whole campaign around that concept, and then exploded that campaign when everyone else was going silent. So that it was amazing. It was an amazing experience, and it was profoundly impactful. So we navigated 9/11. The day after, I thought, that's it. We couldn't imagine how we were going to survive that. And then 2008, 2009, I felt a little less concerned because I'd seen enough about economic downturns, obviously not to that magnitude, and how it didn't affect us all that badly. COVID, whole different game. I mean, we're still, the effects of COVID are still with us on a multitude of fronts. First of all, at the time, we were, even after we'd, reasonably pared down expenses without gutting the organization, our expenses were $12 million a month in 2020, with zero income, for essentially 2 years. So you can do the math on that. Uh, and uh, and obviously our culture got disrupted. We've never really fully yet recovered. We're just going back to 3 day a week in office next week. There was just the amount of disruption, and then constantly, the whole organization just dealing with putting out fires and a changing landscape every day. It was it was cruel for everybody, obviously. Uh, but in our kind of business, it was particularly powerful because income literally went to zero. That it obviously never happened. 2008, 2009, yeah, you went down 10, 15% for a period of time, but to go to zero is just unfathomable. Was just unfathomable.
Sven, what would you change about your industry if you could change one thing?
Broadly, I'd have it way more invested in being a voice for and a resource for protecting the world. It's a huge, huge industry, and God, we could do so much if we elected to do that. Yeah, it's a real opportunity for the industry to say, look, you can't just rely on governments. We are a large private enterprise segment of the global economy. We need the world to be healthy, safe, protected. We can do a lot in that regard. And so if I had one word, in fact, it's something I may reactivate my interest in because I went fairly deep on this issue back in the 1980s, and started a fund actually, called the Travelers Conservation Fund within an organization called the United States Tour Operators Association. And that was the fundamental premise of it.
Well, keep us posted on that. Sven, what most concerns you about the world we're leaving the next generation?
If you live by the philosophy that we don't own our land, we basically borrowed from our children, we are doing so much damage on so many fronts that if I start thinking about it too deeply, I get very, very sad. I mean, when I think of my daughter who's 2.5, believe it or not, I have a 2.5-year-old. I know I shouldn't, but I do. And I have 4 other children. And I think about, what are we doing? There's another definition of conservation, which is that conservation means not doing things that diminish the opportunities for future generations. When I think about, is Delphina going to have clean air? Is she going to be able to dive on a coral reef? Is she going to live in a place where she's secure? Is she going to have the opportunity for good health? Is she going to be able to experience even a fraction of the wonder that I've had the good fortune to experience? Then I can become quite pessimistic. But on the other hand, I say, well, we do have the capacity, we do have the intelligence, we do have the capacity to change this course. We have not yet shown the collective will to do it in a significant enough manner.
We asked these last few questions of all of our guests, and it's difficult in this moment of change to not have a view on what we're doing to this world. And I mean, like, the environment as well as our attention and what we value, I think. And they're just pretty pertinent subjects, but perhaps they are to every generation, who knows, but it feels like it's a particular moment in time.
You just look at the numbers, the statistics, whatever, that the acceleration of negative influences as a consequence of our species in our lifetimes is disproportionately great. Certainly when it comes to the environment and a variety of other things as well. But then we've also made tremendous improvements in certain areas as human beings. But the environment has definitely not been one of them. I remember when Al Gore once said, we have radically altered the relationship between our species and our planet in our lifetimes. That's just an incredible thought. And when I think about what I personally have seen in the coral reefs I've been diving on, and the forests I've been going through, and the river systems I've seen, and the change in Arctic sea ice, and it's just mind-boggling what I personally seen in my life, and it's pretty horrifying. And now when you see, obviously now, at least on a governmental level, we're diminishing our commitment to the environment on a multitude of environment and science on a multitude of fronts. We're opening up the sea to be as a transactional space, to the degree that you can harvest it in the short term, go for it, take as much as you want. Pretty horrifying.
Sven, what's the most exciting thing for you in the next 5 years?
It's interesting because I've spent the first 4 months of 12 months trying to figure out how am I going to best construct my life now that I have made a radical change. Whereas up until January, every day I knew exactly what I had to do, pretty much, and that dominated things. Now that isn't the case, and so I have to create a different architecture. And I haven't figured out the entire answer to that yet. It's a process, and it probably won't take a year, but it'll probably take a few more months before I get the clarity I need in order to move forward as productively as I reasonably can. I want to be a good father, which I did not have the opportunity necessarily to be as good a father as I would have liked with my first 4 kids. That's important. And I want to see how I can have an effect, a more positive effect on how we relate to our environment more broadly. And then how do I leverage who I am, what I've experienced in order to do that.
Thank you, Sven. We look forward to watching the space on that theme. Thank you very much for joining us, and wish you all the best for that endeavor.
Thank you. Well, it was a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much for listening. This has been What the Lux. You can find us on socials at @MuchReform, and drop us any questions or comments on Twitter using the hashtag #WhatTheLux. Or if you're a luxury brand looking for strategy and design that goes beyond the banal, get in touch via hello@muchreform.com and chat to one of our consultants.